Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Okay, thank you now for coming. My name's Amy Draves, and I'm very pleased to welcome Yukari Kane for the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. Yukari is here to discuss her book, Haunted Empire, in which she looks at Apple in the 2 years since Steve Jobs' death, and she reveals the challenges and opportunities for the company as they're going through after losing their leader. Yukari is a veteran journalist with nearly 15 years of experience writing about the tech industry. She was named a Gerald Loeb Award finalist and has worked for the Wall Street Journal, the U.S. News and World Report, and Reuters. Please join me in giving her a very warm welcome.
Thanks for the kind introduction. I'm going to keep my presentation hopefully relatively short to allow for some time to ask questions. This is the last story I did for the Wall Street Journal. I was actually working on my book idea several months earlier in the spring of 2011. And my original idea had been about how Apple became successful and how it got there. Apple was doing double-digit, triple-digit growths in revenue and profits and blowing the most optimistic of estimates out of the water. And it just felt like there was no containing them, and I wanted to do a story about how the team did it, not as much on Steve Jobs. But shortly after this story came out, it became clear that people weren't as interested in the history anymore, and the real question that everyone wanted to know is what happens to Apple now? How does it move beyond Steve, and how is it going to deal with the challenges? And so I shifted directions. And as I thought about the story, I realized that there was a broader theme at work here, and what we were really talking about was this question. What happens to an empire when it loses its emperor? And it's obviously relevant in government. I actually studied what happened in Macedonia after Alexander the Great died, and found some interesting correlations about the dynamics and the human nature that plays into it. But it also is a theme that occurs in business a lot, in a lot of companies. And I'd realized that I'd seen this before in various stages. These are some of the companies that I covered in my career. And they were really interesting because at Motorola, I was covering the company when Chris Galvin was there, and he was trying to get out from under the shadows of his father and his grandfather before him. And I was writing about Nintendo shortly after the current president, Iwata, had been appointed. He was 43 years old, which is unheard of in Japan. It's a very young age. And he was taking over after a president who had been running the company for 53 years. And Sony, of course, doesn't take much explaining, but it still asks the question today about what its co-founder, Akio Morita, would be doing in some of its present-day challenges. And it's very dominant in the company discourse. And so at Apple, I realized that I had a chance to take a front seat and see what happens in the immediate years after a visionary founder is no longer there. And I started with these two questions. This is from my whiteboard in my office. Can power of this magnitude be sustained, and can a great company stay great without its visionary founder? And based on what I knew of Apple at the time, these are the questions that my answers were yes and maybe. And so I embarked on a reporting tour. I traveled around the world. I really thought that it was important to look at Apple from a 360-degree global perspective, because it really is truly a global company. And I went to Europe to talk to Jonathan Ive, the head of Industrial Design's early colleagues and friends and professors. to try to understand where Apple's design philosophy came from. I went to Asia, stayed in Taiwan, and went to Beijing and Shenzhen, Hong Kong, Korea, to understand that region, not just as a big part of Apple's supply chain, but as a market, because it has been Apple's fastest growing market, and what happens there has a huge impact in Cupertino. And I interviewed nearly 200 sources, had multiple conversations with many of them. Most of them have first-person knowledge of the goings-on related to Apple. And I guess the biggest thing that I learned was that Apple's journey is far from over, but it'll never be the same. And this seems really obvious, but it hasn't been over the last couple of years. Apple itself has said over and over and over again that it's still the same company. Nothing has changed without Steve. And to me, that just doesn't hold true, because everything has changed without Steve. Apple was a company that had been synonymous with Steve Jobs' name, and Steve's name was synonymous with Apple's. And not only that, but the company was structured around his strengths and weaknesses, and it was carefully calibrated to work around him. And so when that core is gone, and you've got everything else the same, and you're not acknowledging that things have changed, then I think you do see the equilibrium start to get dismantled. So I saw 3 areas that I wanted to talk about today, where I think the impact of that is really apparent. And I think products are lopsided, marketing has become unconvincing, and business is indecisive. What do I mean by that? My first example is Apple Maps. I don't think I have to explain this very much, but it looked beautiful and it didn't work. It really didn't work. My favorite example is that it labeled Greenland as the Indian Ocean. But I think it's an extreme example of products becoming lopsided towards design, and I do think that's a change. Steve always talked about standing on the intersection of the liberal arts and technology, and I think with respect to development, what he meant by that was that things had to look beautiful, but they had to work as well. And there's no single person at the company right now that embodies both of those qualities. What's interesting is that Apple has put forth Jonathan Ive, the head of industrial design, as Steve's visionary successor. And I think that Johnny absolutely gets the vision and has shared in the vision. I do think, though, that it's a little bit risky, because what makes him possibly the most brilliant industrial designer of our time is that he pushes the limits of how things look without consideration about how things work on the inside. And if he didn't, he wouldn't be the great industrial designer he is today. And when I think about this, I go back to to a story that an engineer was telling me about the development of the Apple TV remote control. Johnny was apparently adamant that it could only have 6 buttons, because anything more than that and it was going to be cluttered. And the problem with that is that when you think about it, 6 buttons means you've got the on and off switch, you've got the home button, and you've got the 4 arrow keys. And where's the volume? And so they went back and forth about this, and Johnny was adamant, and he won the argument, and there's still no volume buttons to this day. And what that means is that that remote control can never be your central device in the living room. And he didn't care. And so I think that that's a small example, but those are the kinds of decisions where things can go in the wrong direction. The second thing I point to is the ads. Ads are really interesting because it's actually the one area where Steve had total control. He did not let anybody else really have any say in it. Phil Schiller, the head of marketing, was never allowed to touch it. He loved the weekly meetings with Shia Day, his advertising agency, and from what I understand, it was one of the last meetings that he gave up before he got too sick to do literally anything. And one of the surprises to me in watching Apple in the immediate aftermath is how quickly the ads changed. And it happened, almost really fast. I think about the iPhone 4S ads where Siri was in the middle, where it was all about Siri, which was a beta product. And the conversations that took place in the ads didn't even work. And that's something that Steve was the kind of guy that caught those things because he knew the power of, seeing something on television, using it at home, and then having it work. And that was part of the magic that Apple was so good at playing off of. And this one, of course, was a series of ads about a year after he died, around the time of the Olympics. And it was interesting because they were very well done. They had the right tone. They had that Apple style. And they were a series of exchanges between Mac geniuses and consumers who didn't know anything. And the genius helped solve the problem. And they actually got yanked within weeks because it got one thing really, really wrong, which is that Apple is all about empowering the consumer. It's not about making them look dumb. And the ads made the consumers look dumb. And so it's interesting that it only took a year to get there. Of course, the question that that's on everybody's minds right now is what comes next? I referred earlier to having studied what happened when Alexander the Great died, and there's an entire book on that topic, and it was very interesting reading it because some of the things that was taking place, you could literally put Tim Cook and Steve in there, and it would apply to what's happening at Apple today. And one of the things that really made me perk up was there's a section where it says that Perdiccas, who was given the power of the empire, had to rule by consensus because after Alexander the Great died, he couldn't get he didn't have the support to get his decisions through. So the only way he could do that is to make sure that he had the majority behind him. And one of the things that I also heard at Apple was that Tim Cook was making a lot more decisions by consensus, which is a change because I think anybody who knows anything about Steve knows that he didn't seek anybody's opinions. And I think people have talked about the fact that it's been 3 years since it was only 3 years between the iPhone and the iPad, and we're going into the fourth year, and why? Yet Tim has been talking about this new product for years, and what's taken so long. And I think that there is that the indecisiveness. If I were in Tim's shoes, I'd be very stressed, not about whether I can hit it big, but about whether he should or not. I mean, one of the things that Steve always talked about was that what was important was to say no as often as it was to say yes. The iPad was killed 3 times before he went out with it. And he didn't let public opinion sway him. And, we'll see. I'm going to be very interested this fall as well. But he also had this power of persuasion that we all know is the reality distortion field. And we all talked about it and did have an appreciation for it, but I think in the years since he's been gone, I have certainly grown to appreciate it more than I've had before, because I think Apple has lost something huge by this. When you think about it, we always thought about the reality distortion field vis-a-vis the media or the consumers, but it was there vis-a-vis his executive team, the employees, the board of directors, the shareholders, the suppliers, and the developers. I mean, he was able to convince people that Apple was doing something amazing, even when there was nothing there, when it was between product cycles, and people had faith, and sometimes, often it was irrational, and he was, and that I think is definitely cracking right now. I was in China, and I heard the suppliers talk to me fairly freely, and to the point that I asked them, why are you willing to share this? And he says, well, there's too many people working on it, and we're not all paid enough to keep our mouths shut. And so, I think that was always true, but before you had Steve's ire to contend with, and without that, it's people talk more, there's less loyalty. The suppliers are more reluctant about taking on Apple's business. And so it was a real thing, and I think it was a big driver for Apple's success, because when you come out with something innovative, part of it, of course, is that it's actually innovative, but the other is perception. And if you don't have the ability to control that perception or manipulate it, it's very hard. I think Apple understands this because it's been out in the media more than it's ever been under Steve. These are just some of the headlines that I picked up. But to me, it does beg the question of, why do they feel like they have to be out there so much when they've always been about very careful messaging? I think it also shows us what happens when you're out there a lot, because there's more fodder for people to criticize. There was an article, a blog, I think, a year or two ago, where the headline was, every time Tim Cook opens his mouth, the stock falls. And the funny thing about that was that every time he opened his mouth, in those occasions, he was saying the same thing, but he just said them in different venues. And so it just gives people an excuse. And I think that as a result, Apple's also losing control over its narrative. So my answer's changed, inevitably. I'm not sure that power of this magnitude can be sustained, because there's just, the more I did research, the more I realized that there's so many forces, a lot of them beyond Apple's control, that just weigh on a company, pulling it towards the middle. Can a great company stay great? I'm still, I guess, looking for that. I don't think Apple can be the same company. It can't be the same great company, but if it changes its definition of great, if it's willing to become something else, then maybe that's possible. Now, I think the last couple of months have been really interesting to me, because Apple finally seems to be realizing this, and it's embracing Steve's last words of advice: never ask what I would do, just do what's right. And we're seeing this in various ways. Beats, of course. You could agree with it, you could disagree with it, but Steve would have never done it. WWDC was interesting as well. I mean, in the past, Steve has owned that. He was the main keynote speaker, and this year we saw Tim giving up the spotlight to some of his other executives like Kirk Federighi. And I think a lot of people remarked that it seemed much more lighthearted and fun as well. And in marketing, Apple has started shifting doing something different there as well. They're taking the advertising more in-house, away from Shia Day. Katie Cotton, the longtime PR head, left, so we'll see what shakes out there. And but the most interesting thing is that Apple has started articulating a new vision of a connected home. And you know, there are obvious challenges. You know, Apple's not the only one who's articulated this vision, but they have, and it's a post-Steve Jobs vision. And I, for one, am really interested to see where they go with that. And to me, the key question now is the following. Can a new vision inspire? You know, they can come out with the best vision possible, but you know, again, it's the combination of whether it has innovation and whether it can corral that perception. And I think that's going to determine where Apple is 10 to 20 years from now. I am happy to take your questions.
Can I have a mic if you don't mind using it, because we can't pick it up otherwise on the video?
Can you comment on what you learned about the aftermath of Steve's management style and the negative impact that it had in real time versus the perception later?
At the time, I mean, Steve had. Steve was very mercurial. He was difficult to work for. I think people dealt with the screaming and the yelling for that word of praise. I mean, he was a very emotional person, and so if something sucked, he told you that it sucked. But if you came back and did something the next day, and it was amazing, he told you it was brilliant, and people lived for that. What I found was that the guys that stayed, including Tim Cook, that worked really well around him, were just calm people who could not be rattled. You know, Avi Tevanian was also like that as well, from what I understand. John Rubinstein, not so much. You know, which could be perhaps one of the reasons why he eventually, you know, left the company. But people, you know, they were able to take in what Steve said and deal with it rationally, because they understood that, you know, Steve at the end of the day just wanted the problem solved. Since then, I mean, I think it's I guess the easiest way to answer that is that I hear that there are a lot of mini Steve Jobses out there in Cupertino now. And that's part of the problem, is that he's become this model for a successful CEO, and it's not. It worked because it was him. It doesn't work for everybody, and you have to be a certain person. A lot of people told me that you know, Phil Schiller used to like to emulate his style, and it did not go down as well as with him as it did with Steve.
So thanks for the investigation of the company. I mean, it's such a part of what we think about, or some of us think about at Microsoft when we come to work every day too, about how our competition is doing. I'm just curious about Beats. I mean, you kind of passed over that. That was a heck of a lot of money for two guys in Hollywood who bought a headphone company from a monster. What is the background there? What have you found out from your sources?
I mean, I personally don't understand it. For every reason that's given, you know, the pervasive thought is that they're buying into Beats Cool. But you know, if the company that defined cool for the last 10 years is buying somebody else's cool, then it kind of shows you where they're going. There's the thought that they're buying Jimmy, the CEO, and I don't know him enough to know whether that's going to work or not. Some of the people that I talk to who know him don't think it's going to work. Part of what they bought was Beats music streaming business and the relationships with Hollywood, which, right, yeah. But they do have the relationships with Hollywood. The problem, I think, is that I think they got a lot of those relationships because Hollywood and the music industry was hoping to beef up competition for Apple. And so when you join Apple, it becomes a different story. And no matter how strong your relationships are, people aren't going to bet against themselves. I mean, they've seen what happened, what Apple could do to an industry, and I think people are too smart today. And when you have what Apple wants in terms of content, everybody else wants. Microsoft wants, Google wants, Netflix wants, Amazon wants, and if you were a content company, I just don't see why you wouldn't give it to everybody, why you would give it just to one company at this juncture. Because they've seen that, no matter how much money Apple puts down, if you don't have an industry at the end of it, it's not worth it.
Could you comment on Scott Forstall's departure from Apple, and as a follow-up, how many of the next team that he brought to Apple are still in place, if you know?
I think Scott, what I heard is that, well, Scott was a really controversial person, and the amazing thing about writing this book is that in terms of the executive team, I got a pretty consistent portrayal of who they were, and one of the things that everybody said about Scott is, diplomatically, is that he was the least liked executive team member by other executive team members. And that would have included Tim Cook, because he was a colleague for a long time, and Tim, Scott did whatever it took. And Tim would have been watching that, and so I don't think that the blood wasn't great to begin with. But then you combine that with Tim's management style, where he gives you enough rope to hang yourself with, and he kind of took that. From what I understand, one of the breaking point was when Scott, in a meeting, challenged him openly, and Tim's not the kind of guy who likes that. I think Tim, what I heard was that Tim himself, when he disagreed with Steve, would wait until everybody else left and discuss it just with Steve. And so that was his style, and he doesn't like to be openly challenged, and he likes team players. In terms of what happened to the team that's... I don't know a ton about that. I mean, I think a lot of people are still there. A lot of people have left because, just in general, because they're tired. I think changing the world is great, the first, second time around. And it becomes a little less exhilarating as you go on.
Could you comment on the book price fixing settlement and how Steve and Tim handled that differently?
Well,
you might want to describe the situation for people who don't know what I'm talking about.
So Apple was accused of
and convicted.
Yes, and convicted of orchestrating this book pricing scheme with digital books. And that resulted in raising the prices. It was a response to Amazon, because Amazon would price books so low that nobody else could compete profitably anyway. And Apple was, and there've been reams of emails and phone conversations, and there's just been a ton of evidence about Apple in discussions with these publishers, and the publishers eventually settled, and Apple went forth with the case, and their main argument was that they're a newcomer to this business, so they have no ability to manipulate anything. And to me didn't really fly, because they do have they have the power of being the dominant company in technology, and being the biggest music retailer. But what was interesting about that was that they were very aggressive in their arguments. I heard later that one of their lawyers knew that they had a losing hand, and so it was just a matter of getting enough stuff in for appeal. But what was interesting to me was that almost a year earlier in the Apple-Samsung trials, they were also aggressive, and they managed to charm and persuade people over to their story. And with the e-book trials, it wasn't a jury, it was a judge. And if you look at her decision, legal files are really boring, but this was one of the most entertaining decisions ever, because she was just, footnotes and comments challenging their sincerity and their testimony, calling Eddie Q out. What was funny was that Eddie Q, who's the head of digital at Apple, was thought to have done a brilliant job testifying, and the judge really didn't take any of that. And it was an example of how Apple had lost control over its narrative. I think if Steve had been there, again, Steve has this power of persuasion that's unmatched, and I think things could have turned out differently. He was able to persuade with no hand.
So I think Steve was a very unique combination of a lot of characteristics and personality traits that was able to create the sort of runaway success that he did, the sort of revolution that he created in technology, right? And I think you very nicely pointed out that there are Steve wannabes now out there that probably more than anything else just make a big ass of themselves, by trying to be like what he was. But you being a technology reporter and being aware of what other companies are doing, what other CEOs are also doing, do you think there is even somebody not necessarily like Steve or like the same traits as Steve, but somebody who can create the sort of effect, the sort of outcome that Steve created for Apple in any other company currently in our industry?
I think it's a complex question. The one that most obviously comes up is Elon Musk. But I think to a certain extent, people like Jeff Bezos, if you are a founding visionary, you have, just in terms of the way your company is set up, you have much more ability to take big risks. And because the board works for you, you don't work for the board, and that makes a huge difference, I think, in how much you have to justify your actions or not at all. And so it gives any company with a visionary founder at the helm an advantage.
I'd love to hear your opinion on some of the other books that have come out about Apple. Like, well, I see you have Isaacson on your cover. Like his book about Jobs. There's the Johnny Ives book, which is like comes off like a hagiography, like makes him look like a saint. And then there's Inside Apple, and so many of these seem like they're positioning Apple in a way for the future. And I'd love your take on that.
Isaacson's book, I've heard, I know there are a lot of different opinions about it. People who know and love Steve don't feel like there's enough of those stories in there, et cetera. Walter was very supportive of my book, and I had a few conversations with him, and one of the things I realized when I talked to him was that he absolutely understood the value of the access he was getting, and he also understood that to a certain extent he was really close as a result. And so his biggest concern was to to put as much of Steve's words in the book as possible for other generations to analyze. And so he saw his book more as a resource for the future. And that's different than any of the other books he's written, because he's just a, you know, he's a brilliant guy, and his analysis on, you know, on historical figures in the past, like Einstein, Benjamin Franklin, is just amazing. But there's not as much of that in this book, and I didn't realize until I spoke to him that that was deliberate, because he thought that was for me and other generations of journalists to come. Adam Lashinsky's Inside Apple, I mean, I thought it was, it's a great primer. It really lays out what a lot of us know about how Apple works, and covering the company in a digestible way. Leander's book about Johnny, I mean, I think, you know, his blog is called Cult of Mac. So there's a definite angle to it. It's very readable. What I've learned about Johnny myself is that he's a much more of a controversial character inside the company. He's not, you know, Apple's a very political place, as probably any company is. They hide it better, but it's a very political place. And what I learned was that Johnny is just as political. The difference is that he's not political for himself as much as he's political for design. I mean, if it's to push forward the interests of design, he will do anything. I think there's Fred Vogelstein's Dogfight about Google and Apple. Fred's a really close friend, and it's an interesting take that he offers, definitely. Okay. Yeah.
We have time for one more question, if anyone.
If you allow me a second question, in talking to your sources about Apple and their world in competition, how did Microsoft come up in the context? How do you find the Apple executives, the inside people in Apple? How do they see the world today in the competitive space, and where does Microsoft fit in, if you don't mind?
Yeah, I won't limit it to what people inside Apple say, because I'm sure that you can guess. But you know, the interesting thing though is that I talked to when I talked to almost 200 people, I talked in every part of Apple's business, and you know, not just Apple, but suppliers as well. I mean, people who watch the entire industry really closely. And I think there's a definite sense that you know, Microsoft is still really in the game, and they're doing some great work. And I mean, I heard some high praise about the phone. You know, I think maybe perception is slow to catch up, but I don't think anybody is. You know, I mean, you have the. I mean, now I'm wading into territory that I don't really know as much, but you know, from somebody who doesn't know anything, I think, you know, regardless of how much Bill Gates is still involved or not involved, the fact that he's kind of present in the background helps the company, and you know, it's definitely part of the sphere that Apple has to worry about. You know, I think others that may not be on everybody's radars, and everybody thinks about Silicon Valley or you know, in terms of content or whatever you think about Amazon and Google and Facebook and that world. But if you take it to the world, we know about Samsung, but the company where Samsung is also looking over its shoulder at China. And it was interesting because when I went to China 2 years ago, this was before Lenovo bought Motorola, people were telling me to watch out for Lenovo because China has is really interested in pushing that company forward. And Lenovo has been making noises, but even back then, that it has global ambitions. And Samsung knows that Lenovo is coming after it, and if it's not Lenovo, it's it's Huawei or somebody else, and they've got a whole country behind them.
Yukari, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.